The phone sat on the kitchen table with its screen dark, and for the third time in an hour, she reached for it without realizing. The call from the doctor was supposed to come yesterday, then today, and now the waiting had stretched into a silence that felt louder than any ring. She knew the test results could change everything, and yet some part of her kept picturing a future where the news was good. That small flame of hope felt almost like a betrayal, because shouldn't she be preparing for the worst instead of imagining relief? The question that sits at the center of a moment like this is simple but sharp. What is hope actually doing when the evidence points toward despair? Most people would say hope is just wanting something good to happen, a kind of wishful thinking that makes the waiting more bearable. And there is some truth to that, because hope certainly paints a picture of a preferred future and holds it in front of the mind. But if hope were only a wish, it would evaporate when reality starts closing doors. And yet this woman noticed something stranger. The hope did not vanish as the hours passed. It just changed shape, becoming less about a specific outcome and more about her own ability to handle whatever came. That subtle shift hints that hope might be more than a feeling. It might be a way of thinking that keeps a person moving when standing still feels impossible. Psychologists who study hope describe it not as a single emotion, but as a cognitive process, a kind of mental engine built from two parts. The first part is agency, the sense that you can take action and make things happen, even if the action is small. The second part is pathways, the ability to see multiple routes toward a goal or to invent new ones when the obvious road gets blocked. Together, agency and pathways form what researchers call hope theory, and for decades, it has helped explain why some people keep going when others stop. But sitting at that kitchen table, the woman could not find a single clear pathway to a good outcome, because the test results were not under her control. She could not work harder, persuade anyone, or outsmart the biology that was quietly being measured in a lab somewhere. That is the first crack in the simple definition. Hope in difficult periods often operates without a clear route, without a plan that guarantees anything. So if pathways disappear, what keeps hope alive when life corners you into a situation where all you can do is wait? The answer begins with a distinction most people miss: the difference between hoping for a specific outcome and hoping in a broader sense of staying open. When she caught herself picturing a future with good news, that was outcome-focused hope, and it was fragile because one phone call could destroy it. But underneath that surface wish, something more durable was happening, something that did not depend on a happy ending. She noticed she was still making tea in the morning, still answering a worried message from a friend, still looking at the trees outside the window and registering their color. Those tiny acts of engagement were themselves evidence of a hope that was less about prediction and more about participation. A psychologist might say she was demonstrating generalized hope, a basic trust that some things in life will remain meaningful even if this particular thing falls apart. This distinction matters because during serious difficulty, outcome hope can actually set a person up for a deeper crash. If you tie all your hope to getting a particular job, a particular apology, or a particular clean scan, then reality has only two options: give it to you or break it. And when reality breaks it, people often feel not just sad but betrayed, as if hope itself was a liar and they were foolish for listening. That is the danger of what some researchers call false hope, not because wishing is wrong, but because investing everything in a single result is like building a house on one fragile beam. Realistic hope, by contrast, acknowledges the full range of possibilities and still says, I will stay open, I will stay connected, I will keep moving. It does not demand a happy ending. It commits to staying alive to the possibility that something good might grow, even in difficult soil. The woman at the table did not know any of this yet, but she was already practicing it by getting up, by making the tea, by noticing the trees. Each small, ordinary act was a pathway she could walk, not toward a guarantee, but toward a life that remained worth living regardless. Underneath this shift is a mechanism that psychologists have observed in people facing chronic illness, prolonged uncertainty, and even grief. When the external situation cannot be changed, hope often turns inward and reorganizes around meaning rather than outcome. A person with a serious diagnosis might stop hoping to be declared cured by next month and start hoping to have a good conversation with their child today. The goal becomes smaller, closer, more concrete, and yet in a strange way more powerful because it can be reached. This is not lowering standards. It is changing the kind of hope from a distant destination to an immediate practice. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived concentration camps, wrote that those who could find meaning even in suffering were more likely to endure. He was not describing hope as a naive belief in rescue, but as the act of holding on to a reason to continue, even when the outer world offered none. Modern research on coping echoes this insight. Finding meaning in difficulty is associated with better psychological adjustment and a sense of coherence. But meaning alone cannot fully explain how hope survives, because sometimes the question is not why keep going, but how to keep going when your brain and body are exhausted. This brings us to a biological dimension, not as a simple chemical cause, but as a piece of a larger pattern. The brain's reward system involves dopamine, which is often described as a pleasure chemical, but is more accurately a chemical of anticipation and motivation. Dopamine rises not just when we get something good, but when we are pursuing something that matters, when there is a gap between where we are and where we want to be. That gap is where hope lives, and the anticipation of closing that gap helps the brain continue investing effort. During prolonged stress, that system can get disrupted, which is why depression often robs people of the ability to anticipate anything positive. But here is the crucial detail. Small completions, like finishing that cup of tea or responding to a message, still produce modest dopamine signals. Each tiny act of agency, no matter how small, can create a micropulse of motivation that serves as a stepping stone to the next act. In this way, hope is not a single reserve tank that runs dry, but something that can be rebuilt in small increments through action itself. That is a radically different picture from the idea of hope as a passive feeling that simply comes and goes. It suggests that hope is partly a practice, a series of small choices that remind the brain that effort can still produce something meaningful. And yet, even this practical version of hope has its limits, because severe difficulty can overwhelm any amount of small actions. There are conditions where the pain is so great, the loss so deep, that telling someone to find meaning or take small steps can feel like asking them to breathe underwater. That is when hope becomes not a solo project, but something that needs another person to hold it first. A friend who sits without pushing for optimism, a nurse who describes the next step clearly, a therapist who names the pain honestly. These relationships can carry hope when the person cannot generate it inside. Hope, in other words, is social, and during difficult periods, it often arrives through the voice of someone else until the person's own voice can join in. This also clarifies why isolation is so dangerous during a crisis. It cuts off the very external channels through which hope is often restored. Now the woman at the kitchen table was not alone. Her friend had sent a message that morning, and she had almost ignored it because she had nothing good to say. But she had answered anyway, not with optimism but with honesty, and the simple exchange had made the room feel slightly less airtight. That moment was not a sudden infusion of cheerfulness. It was a reminder that her life was still connected to other lives, and connection is a foundation on which hope can rebuild. If we step back, a clear pattern emerges. Hope during difficult periods is not one thing, but a layering of several processes. It is the cognitive engine of agency and pathways, the shift from outcome to meaning, the small biological rewards of small actions, and the social embrace that holds a person when they cannot hold themselves. But there is still one more layer, the deepest one, and it is the one that most people resist because it sounds like the opposite of hope. The deepest layer is the willingness to acknowledge the worst without letting that acknowledgement become a closed door. The woman at the table allowed herself to imagine the doctor saying something hard, and she felt the wave of cold that followed that image. But she did not stay inside that wave. She let it pass, and then she noticed the tea was steeped and warm in her hands. That movement, from the worst thought back to the present sensation, is the heart of what psychologists call acceptance-based coping. Acceptance is not giving up. It is making room for reality, as it is right now, which paradoxically frees up energy that was being spent on denial and resistance. When you stop fighting the fact that you are afraid and uncertain, you can use that energy to notice what is still here, what is still possible, and what the next small step might be. That is why hope and fear can coexist. Because hope that has passed through acceptance is not a denial of the dark. It is a decision to look at the dark and still open the curtains. Now we arrive at the central reversal that changes the meaning of everything that came before. The common understanding says that hope is the opposite of despair, that you are either hopeful or hopeless depending on whether things look bright or dark. But the evidence from psychology, from biology, and from lived experience points toward a different conclusion. Hope is not a prediction about how things will turn out. It is a stance you take toward an uncertain future, regardless of how things look. It is the choice to remain invested in life, to remain open to possibility, to continue acting and connecting, even when the data says the odds are bad. That choice does not guarantee a good outcome, and it does not remove pain, but it changes the experience from one of frozen waiting to one of active living. The woman at the table had been waiting for the phone for 2 days, with the terrible sense that her life was on pause. But in those small acts, making tea, answering a friend, looking at trees, she had in fact been living, and that living was hope in action. The phone call, when it finally came, would bring information, and that information would matter deeply, but it would not define the whole meaning of her day or her life. Because hope, reconstructed in this way, is not a hostage to the event, it is a quality of the person facing the event. This is the climax of the story. Hope is not a fragile wish that shatters on contact with reality. It is a practice of staying human in the presence of uncertainty. And that practice can be measured not in outcomes, but in moments, in the number of times a person reaches toward life, even when life has pushed them back. One could say that the truest test of hope is not a happy ending, but a difficult morning that was nevertheless lived with a small opening of the hand toward what might come. This does not mean that everyone in difficult circumstances should feel hopeful or that someone who cannot find hope is failing. There are seasons when hope is simply unavailable, and that absence is not a moral failure. It is part of the human response to overwhelming pain. But for many people, understanding hope as a practice rather than a prediction can shift the entire experience of a difficult period. Instead of asking, "Am I still hopeful?" which is like checking a fuel gauge, they can ask what small act of engagement is available to me right now. They can notice that putting on shoes, opening a curtain, sending one honest sentence to a friend are all ways of saying yes to life without pretending to know the outcome. And when someone cannot do even that, the hope held by another person can be borrowed until they are strong enough to take a breath on their own. Return now to the kitchen table, where the phone remains dark, but the woman's posture has shifted slightly. Her shoulders are still tight, the fear is still present, but she is looking at the pattern of light on the table, rather than staring at the blank screen. That subtle change is not a cure, but it is a clue to what hope actually looks like in the middle of a hard time. It looks less like a triumphant smile and more like the quiet refusal to turn away from the parts of life that are still here. It looks like a person who is afraid, but who still notices that the tea is warm, that a friend cares, that the trees outside have not stopped growing. This is not optimism, which assumes things will work out. It is hope, which holds a place for good while acknowledging that bad is also possible. That distinction is vital because optimism can be shattered, but hope that has made room for difficulty is far harder to break. In the days and weeks that follow, she will learn more about her condition and face treatments that demand more than she thought she could give. But she will carry with her a tool she did not know she was using at that kitchen table: the ability to shift her hope from the distant outcome to the next small step. And each time she takes that step, the fog of waiting lifts just enough for her to see that her life is not on hold, it is happening. Hope, in the end, is not a guarantee against the dark. It is the decision to light a small candle and keep it lit, one careful breath at a time.